capable of supporting democratic institutions, and thus everyone would in the long run be better off. In other words, what he articulated was something that was very similar to the view of many economists that saw the defeat of the communist world as an important step on the road toward an integrated world economy. A single world economy, as opposed to a collection of national economies that to a greater or lesser extent interact with one another. This overall vision was also at the base of one of the first experiments to put this kind of a vision to a test. And thus, talking about trade in international politics, a good starting point is to look at the European Union. Because in many ways, the European Union represents the best case scenario for that vision of the road being on a world to a completely integrated economy, a single economy. The European Union, as such, began that experiment on the basis of pretty shaky foundations. Given that Europe had been the center of major warfare and major conflict, so much so that in 1945 it would be difficult to envision Germany and France living peacefully side by side and cooperating with one another, given the depth of animosities that had built up between those two states in the previous century and a half. The two countries having fought 4 bloody wars against each other, beginning with the Napoleonic Wars, subsequently the Franco-Prussian War, in which Germany was victorious, and culminating in World War I and finally World War II. On the one hand, these conflicts demonstrated the enormous animosities between these two societies, but the utter destruction that was unleashed on Germany in particular, and the enormous cost of the Second World War more generally, also at the same time demonstrated the futility of a state system in which these kinds of wars were a periodic reality. And while that periodic reality of conflict might have been acceptable 100 years earlier, or 200 years earlier, or 300 years earlier, when these conflicts took place with bows and arrows and spears and a few cannon, by 1945, it was evident that this kind of a conflict was utterly unacceptable, utterly contrary to the desires and hopes of people living within Europe. But nonetheless, it's one thing to recognize that. It's another thing to figure out some way to get these countries to make common cause with each other. And the first step in this regard was taken in the form of the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan rested on, and we talked about it a bit in previous discussions, on the perception by U.S. policymakers in particular that in the aftermath of the defeat of Nazi Germany and subsequently fascist Japan, the next major conflict would be that between the Western capitalist countries and the Soviet Union. And that in order for the Western capitalist states, liberal democracies, to prevail in that conflict, it was important that the heartland of these liberal democracies, Western Europe, be reconstructed as quickly as possible. In essence, from the point of view of the United States, such a rapid reconstruction would undermine the appeal of left-wing and communist parties within Western Europe, and thus allow the redevelopment of Western Europe in a democratic context without threatening the survival of market capitalism and liberal democracy more generally. It, of course, also signified an important element of American economic interests, meaning that by the end of the Second World War, the United States and U.S. industries had become crucially dependent on the markets that were provided for American goods during the Second World War, such as tanks, planes, and so on and so forth. But for these industries to survive, they would have to have a similar market for their goods, even if the goods they were starting to convert to increasingly became cars and civilian airliners and things along those lines. And thus, pumping $14 billion, or the equivalent today would be $500 billion, into Western Europe was, on the one hand, a strategic necessity in the opening days of the Cold War from the perspective of the United States, but was also, at the same time, and for that reason, sellable to the American public, a kind of a subsidy to American industries. Much of that money would circulate right back into the United States in the form of purchases by European powers for crucial inputs into their economies. It did, however, have two impacts on Western Europe that were important in shaping the future of the European continent. One is the emphasis on the Soviet threat. That, to a certain extent, allowed countries like France and Germany that had little or nothing in common with each other to put their differences aside and look at each other from the point of view of my enemy's enemy is my friend, even if I don't like him very much. The other side is that the Marshall Plan funds were administered in Europe largely cooperatively. In other words, they required the countries of Western Europe to take that first step of acting cooperatively. And for symbolic reasons, that may have been important in the continuation of European history. The Marshall Plan only lasted 4 years, and it's not entirely coincidental, therefore, that at the end of the Marshall Plan, Europeans began to think for themselves to a certain extent on how to push forward in their economic development, and in particular, how to settle their differences. And it was the leadership of France and Germany, in particular France, that came to the conclusion that the best means to end conflict in Europe, and conflict in Europe would certainly invite Soviet power into Europe and weaken the Western alliance, was economic integration. Economic integration. And the first and most crucial step toward that economic integration, and the step that would make war between the various members of the Western European community unthinkable and impossible, was to unify the industries that were crucial to any kind of a war effort by any state within Western Europe. And based on the experiences of World War I and World War II, the two most crucial industries in this regard were the coal industry and the steel industry, which are of course closely linked. The production of coal, the production of steel requires an enormous amount of coal. But coal also is, of course, the key fuel for the war machines, or was the key fuel for the war machines of World War I in particular, and to a lesser extent World War II. By combining the steel industries and the coal industries of France and Germany, neither of them would be independently able to develop a war machine that could threaten the other. European coal and steel community consisted of 6 countries: France, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and I'm forgetting one, but it's in your textbook. Was the first step to a far more ambitious project, which materialized in 1957 in the negotiation of what became known as the Rome Treaty, which established the European Economic Community. The European Economic Community. In other words, the idea of integration shifted from a set of industries particularly relevant to national security concerns to the creation of what might best be described as a customs union, meaning that the member states of the European community would establish a common set of trade restrictions, of customs, and by doing so, create consistent protection from outside the European Union, and to a large extent free up trade within the European Union itself. Roughly 30 years later, that was followed by the Single European Act, which led the way in 1991 to the Maastricht Treaty and the creation of the European Union. And the European Union was a rather crucial step, starting in 1991. While my passport is still a German passport, on the cover it states the European Union, meaning that essentially, as a German citizen, I am also a citizen of Europe as a whole, and for that reason can work in any part of Europe, can make use of services in any part of Europe. It creates a single economy, although it still falls significantly short of creating a single polity. The Maastricht Treaty also set in motion the process of unifying the currencies of all member states, which by 1991 included a fairly large number of Western European countries, most importantly also including Great Britain, although Great Britain remained the slow ship in the flotilla, as it's often referred to in European politics, insofar as that it's kind of dragged its heels on a number of issues in regard to European integration for complex sets of reasons that we may get to discuss at another point. The currency union essentially removed all barriers to the free flow of goods and services throughout Europe, and is in that sense a crucial step toward creating a supranational entity, And what I mean by a supranational entity is one that subsumes the sovereignty of its member states, or pools the sovereignty, as many like to describe it, into a single unit, in which the European Union now becomes a state, not the individual states within it. And to a considerable extent, the European Union has of course succeeded. War between France and Germany is far more unthinkable today than it was back in 1947, when the first step of the coal and steel community was taken. But as most of you know, it is not entirely without its problems. And we'll talk about some of those problems later. It is also not quite there yet, meaning that so far, the skepticism of many realists having pointed to the basic fact that there is not a single example throughout the history of states in the international system of a state voluntarily surrendering its sovereignty to another entity, to a greater entity. the European Union isn't there yet. So far, the government in Brussels has only the powers that have been transferred to it by the member states. And implicit in that transfer of powers is that these states can take these powers back if they choose to do so. But the goal is nonetheless, eventually, that there will not be sovereign entities within Europe other than the European Union itself. And crucial steps in that direction that have yet to be taken are, from the point of view of international relations in particular, that each of the member states of the European Union, despite extensive efforts to overcome this situation, still have their own foreign policies. And while those foreign policies in many cases do align with one another, in many other cases they do not. This was well illustrated in 2003 in the period leading up to the US invasion of Iraq, in which the US, wanting to do so with a general endorsement from the United Nations, which it failed to get, instead opted to put together a coalition of the willing. And that coalition of the willing divided the European Union rather substantially, with some of the key states, Great Britain, choosing to join the coalition of the willing, as did Spain and Italy initially. And others, very crucially, France and Germany, resisting it and opposing it. With separate foreign policies, essentially, you do not have a single state. What is even further removed from the European Union at this point is a single defense establishment. So far, each of these member states still maintains their own military establishments, although again, as the German Defense Minister von Leyen stated last week, Germany is slowly overcoming some of the problems that prevent it from integrating into the European Union more generally, in particular its reluctance to use its military forces outside of Germany itself, in particular outside of NATO. And that certainly the long-term goal is for an eventual complete integration of those defense functions as well. So the European Union has gone a long ways, but as we will discuss in more detail, in the process it has come across some major stumbling blocks that also relate to a considerable extent to our topic today, which is trade. Those stumbling blocks have surfaced, in particular in the set of countries generally described as the PIGS, Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Spain, and Greece, that have run into severe problems in managing their domestic economic affairs, in particular their levels of debt. A problem that could have been relatively easily solved in the absence of a currency union. Extensive indebtedness, which is usually the result of a balance of payments deficit, in other words, the result of importing more than you actually export, and therefore piling up debt, is generally solved in the international system by devaluing the currency of the country that faces these kinds of problems. A weaker drachma, in the case of Greece, would make imports into Greece from the European Union more expensive and would make Greece more attractive as a tourist destination because it's cheaper, as well as making Greek products more competitive on European markets. And those two things combined would generally lead to a normalization of the trade relationship between Greece and the European Union. Given that it is now under the euro, it can no longer devalue, and thus that lever is no longer available for dealing with those problems. Pessimists argue that this is the Achilles heel of the European Union. That the European Union developed too fast in the economic level without allowing political institutions to catch up, and that this ultimately will tear the European Union apart. Those that make that point argue that essentially the European Union is not that different from the United States. The United States likewise consists of a number of different entities at highly different stages of development and with very different economies, and thus likewise would be likely to face these kinds of problems if it were not for the fact that in the United States, rather unambiguously, the federal government is empowered to redistribute resources from the regions that benefit from that overall union to those that are less well off. In other words, in the case of the United States, well, the United States is a difficult example these days because if we look at what's happening in Detroit, for example, there are severe problems there as well. But so far, the federal government has never allowed a particular state within the United States to go bankrupt. Essentially, the obligation to bail that state out is more or less implicit in the system of federalism within